April 1945, West Texas, dust hanging in the air like a question. 47 Japanese nurses step off cattle trucks at Camp Crystal Springs, still wearing torn Red Cross uniforms from Manila. They'd been taught Americans were demons, trained to fear torture and worse, but through the barbed wire fence they see something that makes no sense. Four cowboys herding cattle past the camp. Big hats, bow-legged walks, one singing off-key. They look ridiculous. The women laugh. It's the first sound of joy they've made in months. One nurse mimics the walk, another tips an imaginary hat. Then one cowboy stops his horse, makes eye contact through the fence, tips his hat back. That gesture changes everything, because 3 weeks later that same cowboy would do something impossible, something that could cost him everything in a town that already hated him for showing mercy to the enemy. But before we dive in, if you want more incredible untold stories from history, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. The cattle trucks rolled to a stop in a cloud of West Texas dust, and Keiko Tanaka braced herself for whatever came next. Through the slats, she could see wooden barracks instead of concrete cells, a mess hall with a tin roof that glinted in the April sun, and guards who looked more nervous than cruel. This wasn't what the propaganda had promised. The propaganda had prepared them for beatings and starvation, for the kind of systematic brutality they'd heard whispered about in Manila General Hospital before the city fell. But nobody had prepared them for this strange mercy that felt more dangerous than violence ever could. The truck's gate dropped open with a metallic clang. Keiko stepped down first, her torn Red Cross uniform hanging loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds since February. Behind her, 46 other women descended in silence, their eyes scanning for threats, their bodies tensed for the first blow. Instead, an American guard stepped forward and carefully, almost gently, lifted an elderly woman's small bundle of belongings from the truck bed. He set it down at her feet and nodded. The old woman stared at him like he'd performed magic. Keiko touched the photo hidden in her sleeve, the one of Hiroshi in his teacher's jacket taken 3 weeks before he was drafted. She'd carried it through the fall of Manila, through the cattle cars north, through interrogations where staying silent was the only weapon she had left. The photo's edges were soft now from touching, from the habit of reaching for proof that she'd once had a life where love existed and the future stretched out like an open road. Lieutenant Sarah Chin appeared in the doorway of the nearest barracks, her army uniform crisp despite the heat, her expression carefully neutral. She was Chinese-American, Keiko had learned during processing, which meant she lived in some impossible middle ground between prisoner and guard, translator and witness. Chin spoke in clear Japanese, her accent carrying hints of both Iowa and her parents' Cantonese household. Welcome to Camp Crystal Springs. You'll be assigned bunks in groups of 6. There's a latrine building to the east, a mess hall to the west. Dinner is at 1800 hours. The water here is safe to drink. Safe to drink. The words hung in the air like an accusation. In Manila, they'd boiled everything twice and still lost patients to dysentery. Here, apparently, water came clean from taps. The barracks smelled like fresh pine and old hay, a converted stable that someone had scrubbed until it gleamed. 6 bunks lined each wall, thin mattresses over wooden slats, but mattresses nonetheless. Real blankets folded at each foot, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Through the window, Keiko could see the perimeter fence, and beyond it, endless Texas prairie rolling toward a horizon that looked like freedom, if you didn't know better. That first night, they ate bread that was actually soft, soup that had visible pieces of chicken, and coffee that tasted like it came from real beans instead of burned grain. The women ate in silence, waiting for the catch, for the moment when this strange performance of civility would crack open and reveal the truth underneath. Keiko watched the guards watching them, saw how young most of them were, how their hands shook slightly when they poured water, how they looked away when the women met their eyes. These boys were afraid, not of the prisoners, but of something else, of making a mistake maybe, of becoming the monsters their own propaganda said they weren't. On the third morning, Keiko stood near the eastern fence with Maria Santos and Yuki Nakamura, watching four men on horseback herd cattle past the camp. The men wore hats so large they looked cartoonish, their legs bowed from years in the saddle, and one of them was singing something off-key that might have been a cowboy song or might have been a cry for help. They moved with a kind of casual confidence that seemed absurd in a world at war, as if cows and fences mattered more than empires and death counts. Yuki started to giggle first. Then Maria joined in, one hand over her mouth like she was trying to hold it back. Then Keiko felt it rising in her own chest, that dangerous bubble of laughter that had been trapped for months, and suddenly she was laughing too, really laughing, at these ridiculous men who looked like children playing dress-up in their father's clothes. One woman behind them began mimicking the bow-legged walk, swaggering back and forth inside the fence. Another pretended to tip an enormous invisible hat. "They look like roosters," someone called out in Japanese. "No, like penguins in costume." The singing cowboy heard them. He pulled his horse to a stop maybe 20 feet from the fence and turned in his saddle. Keiko met his eyes across the distance. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 50, with weathered skin and crow's feet that spoke of decades under this brutal sun. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he reached up slowly, deliberately, and tipped his hat. Not mocking, not angry, just an acknowledgement. One human seeing another. He clicked his tongue and his horse moved on. The laughter died in Keiko's throat. She watched him ride away, watched the dust settle behind his horse's hooves, and felt something crack in the careful wall she'd built around hope. That gesture had been kind. Worse than kind, it had been respectful. And respect was the most dangerous thing of all, because it required her to reconsider everything she'd been taught about demons and enemies and the clean lines that supposedly separated good from evil. That night, Lieutenant Chen delivered the news that would change everything. They would work. American law required it. 50 cents per day paid in camp scrip, picking cotton and vegetables on nearby farms. Including, Chen said with careful emphasis, Morgan Ranch. The ranch with the Cowboys, the one owned by the man who tipped his hat. Keiko stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "We're Red Cross, protected under Geneva. You can't make us work for the enemy war effort." Chen's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Sympathy, maybe. Or exhaustion. "So does capturing hospital staff violate Geneva, Miss Tanaka. But here's what I know. You'll eat better than you have in a year. Nobody's going to touch you. You can sit in this camp going crazy, or you can work for wages and buy small things that make life bearable. Your choice." Keiko sat back down. Around her, the women whispered in rapid Japanese, voices rising and falling like waves. Outside, the Texas night pressed against the windows, vast and strange and full of stars that looked the same as the ones over Manila, but somehow felt different. Tomorrow they would become the Cowboys' co-workers. Tomorrow the clean lines would blur even further. And Keiko wasn't sure whether that terrified her or gave her the first real reason to keep breathing since the day Hiroshi's telegram arrived and turned her whole world into ash. The truck bed was hard and the morning was already hot when they arrived at Morgan Ranch. Keiko stood with the other women in a neat line while Lieutenant Chen spoke with the ranch foreman, a weathered man named Billy Shaw, who kept his hat pulled low and his eyes on the ground. Two guards flanked the group, rifles held at ease but present, a reminder that mercy had limits and rules still applied. Beyond the vegetable rows, Keiko could see the Cowboys working cattle in a distant pen, their movements practiced and smooth, a world operating according to rhythms that had nothing to do with war. Billy Shaw gestured toward the rows of vegetables that needed picking, his instructions brief and clipped. Tomatoes first, then beans, working east to west, to follow the shade. The women spread out in pairs, their movements stiff with tension, and began to work. Keiko bent to the first plant, her hands remembering the careful precision of surgical work, and tried not to think about how she'd gone from saving lives to picking food for the people who'd bombed her city. Maria worked beside her in silence, her face carefully blank, That same emotional distance she'd worn since Manila fell and her fiancé disappeared into the chaos. The sun climbed higher. Sweat soaked through their thin shirts and the dust coated their throats until breathing felt like swallowing sand. Keiko straightened her back every few minutes, trying to ease the ache that had settled between her shoulder blades, and watched the Cowboys watching them from across the field. Billy Shaw stood near his truck, arms crossed, his jaw working on something that might have been tobacco or might have been anger. She caught fragments of his conversation with Frank Morgan, the man who'd tipped his hat 3 days ago. Billy's voice carried across the morning air, low but sharp. "Boss, this don't feel right. My brother died in Bataan, died in one of their camps, and here we are, paying them to pick our vegetables." Frank's response was quieter, harder to hear, but Keiko caught enough. Something about doing it by the book, something about Geneva Conventions and not becoming what they were fighting against. Billy spat into the dirt and walked away, his boots kicking up small clouds with each step. By midday, the heat had become a physical thing, pressing down like a hand on the back of the neck. Keiko's vision started to blur at the edges, her movements slowing despite her efforts to maintain the same steady pace. She'd learned in nursing school that heat exhaustion came in stages, recognized the warning signs in her own body, but pride kept her working. Stopping meant weakness. Weakness meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant proving every terrible thing they'd been taught about surrender. Then she heard the truck engine. Frank Morgan drove across the field with a water barrel in the truck bed, the metal container sweating condensation in the brutal sun. He stopped near the women's section, climbed out without a word, and began scooping ice into the barrel from a burlap sack. Real ice. Precious ice that someone had driven miles to get, that cost money and effort, that wasn't required by any regulation or rule. He worked methodically, breaking up the larger chunks with the handle of a shovel, his movements unhurried despite the heat. Through Lieutenant Chen's translation, his words were simple and direct. "Drink when you need to. We ain't the Nazis." The women stared at the barrel like it might vanish if they looked away. Finally, Yuki moved forward first, her hands shaking slightly as she dipped the tin cup that hung from the barrel's side. She drank deeply, water running down her chin, and when she stepped back, her eyes were wet with something that wasn't sweat. One by one, the others followed, and Keiko watched Frank Morgan's face as they drank. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't performing kindness for an audience. He was just a man who'd brought water to people who needed it, the same way he'd probably done for his ranch hands 1,000 times before. When Keiko finally stepped forward to drink, the cold water hit her throat like a revelation. She drank until her stomach hurt, then filled the cup again for Maria, who'd hung back until everyone else had finished. As she turned away, she saw Frank walking back to his truck, his shoulders straight despite the heat. But then he paused at a fence post near the barn, and Keiko followed his gaze to the small photograph tucked there. A young man in uniform, dark hair, easy smile, the kind of face that belonged to someone who'd never expected to die young. Frank's hand reached out to straighten the photo, his fingers gentle against the weathered paper, and in that moment Keiko understood. This wasn't about politics or patriotism or proving anything to anyone. This was about a father who'd lost his son and was trying to find some way to make that loss mean something other than just more hate piled onto an already burning world. She turned back to the vegetable rows, her throat tight with something she couldn't name. Around her, the other women worked with slightly straighter backs, their movements less defensive, as if cold water had loosened something that fear had locked tight. Even the guards seemed different, less rigid in their postures, as if kindness was contagious and they'd all caught a mild case. That afternoon, Keiko noticed the water pump that served both the field station where the workers took breaks and Frank's barn across the way. It had broken sometime in the night, the handle hanging loose and useless. She watched Frank work on it for nearly an hour, his hands black with grease, his face set in concentration. When he finally got it working again, he didn't test his own barn's connection first. He walked to the worker's side, pumped the handle 3 times, and waited until clear water flowed before he moved on. It was a small thing. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it was just practicality, fixing the problem in the order it appeared. But Keiko had spent too many years reading people's intentions in operating rooms, learning to trust the small gestures that revealed character, and she knew truth when she saw it. This man had chosen to fix their water first, had chosen to bring ice on a day when the heat could kill, had chosen to see them as human beings who got thirsty and tired instead of as enemies who deserved whatever suffering came their way. The truck ride back to camp was quieter than the morning journey. The women sat with their earned scrip in their pockets, 50 cents for a day's work, enough to buy soap or writing paper or small luxuries that made captivity slightly less suffocating. Keiko pressed her back against the truck's side and watched Morgan Ranch disappear behind them, the barn and fences and vegetable rows fading into the dust. Tomorrow they would come back. Tomorrow and the day after and all the days until the war ended or they were shipped home or something else changed the equation. But tonight, for the first time since Manila fell, Keiko went to sleep without checking the shadows for threats. Tonight, she dreamed of cold water instead of bombs, and when she woke in the darkness with Hiroshi's name on her lips, the grief felt slightly different. Not lighter exactly, just less like drowning and more like learning to swim with stones in her pockets. 3 weeks passed and the rhythm of work became something almost normal. The women learned English in fragments, practical phrases that turned survival into something approaching communication. More water, please. Thank you. Too hot. The words felt strange in their mouths at first, like stones being rolled around, but gradually they smoothed into tools that made the days easier. Keiko found herself translating less as the others grew braver, testing their voices in this new language, stumbling over pronunciations that made the Cowboys grin but never laugh cruelly. The rattlesnake appeared on a Tuesday morning, coiled near the irrigation ditch where Yuki had gone to refill water buckets. Tommy Reeves saw it first, his eyes going wide, and he didn't waste time with words. He pointed at the snake and made a sharp hissing sound through his teeth, his whole body tense with warning. The women froze. Tommy hissed again, louder, and made a weaving motion with his hand. Snake, danger, stay back. The meaning transcended language, written in the universal grammar of fear and survival. After that, the Cowboys taught them the hiss and point system for spotting dangers in the field. They practiced it like a game during water breaks, Tommy pretending to spot imaginary threats while the women practiced the warning sound. Their hisses were terrible at first, more like tea kettles than snakes, and everybody laughed. Real laughter, the kind that bent people double and made their sides hurt. Keiko laughed until tears ran down her face, and when she finally caught her breath, she realized she couldn't remember the last time joy had felt this uncomplicated. One afternoon, Tommy decided to teach them how to whistle for the ranch dogs. He demonstrated, 2 fingers in his mouth, a sharp, piercing sound that brought 3 border collies running from across the field. The women tried to copy him, their attempts producing mostly spit and frustrated puffs of air. Yuki's whistle sounded like a dying bird. Maria's was just aggressive breathing. Keiko managed something that might have been mistaken for a whistle if you were very generous and slightly deaf. The Cowboys doubled over laughing, and the women laughed too at themselves, at the absurdity of war prisoners learning to call dogs while the world burned itself, to ash on both sides of the Pacific. But then the town's anger found them. The first sign came on a Sunday when Frank's truck window was shattered by a rock wrapped in paper. The note was brief and ugly. Jap lover. Traitor. The words were meant to cut, and they did, but not in the way the sender probably intended. Keiko saw the broken glass glinting in the truck bed when they arrived for work Monday morning, saw how Frank's jaw was set a little tighter, how his movements were a little more deliberate, as if he was holding something heavy and refusing to let it show. The town's pastor had preached a sermon about harboring enemies among them, about how mercy to the wicked was cruelty to the righteous, about how good Christian folk needed to remember who the enemy was and what they'd done. The sermon made its way through the community like wildfire, and suddenly Frank Morgan was the topic of every coffee shop conversation and every backyard fence discussion. People who'd bought cattle from him for 20 years started looking the other way when he walked past. The hardware store owner suddenly couldn't extend credit anymore. Small cruelties that added up to isolation. Billy Shaw confronted Frank one morning while the women worked the bean rows. Keiko couldn't hear every word, but she caught enough to understand the shape of the argument. Billy's voice rising in frustration, something about reputation and respect, and whether this was really worth losing everything he'd built. Frank's response was quieter, measured, the words of a man who'd already made his decision and wasn't interested in relitigating it. "I didn't ask for a reputation. I asked for sleep at night." Billy walked away shaking his head, and for the rest of the morning the tension hung over the field like humidity before a storm. Keiko worked faster, trying to prove through productivity that they were worth whatever cost Frank was paying, that his choice to show them basic humanity wasn't a mistake. But she knew better. She knew that kindness in wartime was always expensive, and the people who paid the highest prices were usually the ones who could least afford it. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of golden light that made Texas look almost gentle. The women finished their rows early, their movements efficient from weeks of practice, and gathered near the truck to wait for transport back to camp. That's when they heard the music. An old phonograph playing somewhere near the barn, the sound scratchy but clear, a woman's voice singing about wanting to be a cowboy's sweetheart. The melody was distinctly American, twangy and bright, but something in it felt universal. Longing, dreams, the desire to be something more than circumstances allowed. Yuki started humming along first. She'd heard American music in Manila before the war, when the city was still cosmopolitan and strange songs drifted from clubs and radios. Her voice found the melody and followed it, adding harmonies that came from somewhere deeper than practice. Then Maria joined in, and soon half the women were humming, their voices blending in a way that wasn't quite Japanese and wasn't quite American, but was somehow both. The sound rose and fell like breath, like prayer, like the kind of music that existed before borders and flags divided the world into us and them. The Cowboys stopped working. Tommy set down the fence post he'd been carrying. Billy paused mid-step. Frank stood by his truck, one hand on the hood, his head tilted slightly as he listened. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just let the moment exist. This strange harmony of enemy voices singing an American song in a Japanese style while the war raged on in places they couldn't see but couldn't forget. When the song ended, the silence felt sacred. Then Frank called across the field, his voice carrying clear in the evening air. "Y'all sing real pretty," Lieutenant Chin translated, and Keiko responded before she could stop herself. "Your music is strange, but not bad." Through Chin's translation, the words made Frank smile. Really smile, not the polite expression he usually wore, but something genuine that reached his eyes and softened the hard lines around his mouth. "That's about the nicest thing a prisoner ever said to me." That night, lying in her bunk with the sounds of 46 other women breathing in the darkness around her, Keiko touched Hiroshi's photo and whispered to it in Japanese. "I think maybe the world is more complicated than they told us. I think maybe mercy isn't always weakness and enemies aren't always demons. I think maybe I'm learning something here that I was supposed to learn even though I don't understand why yet." Outside, the Texas stars burned cold and distant, and somewhere across town, Frank Morgan sat at his kitchen table making a decision that would change everything, writing a letter to Colonel Hastings requesting permission for something so unusual that it bordered on madness. An invitation, a dinner, a chance to prove that humanity could survive even in the middle of hell if someone was brave enough to practice it. Frank Morgan arrived at Camp Crystal Springs on a Thursday afternoon with his hat in his hands and a request that made Lieutenant Chin blink twice before she responded. He wanted to invite the prisoners to Sunday dinner at his ranch. Memorial Day weekend. Supervised, of course, properly chaperoned, but a real meal, at a real table, in a real home. His wife had died 2 years back, and the house felt too empty on holidays, and it seemed to him that these women could use a home-cooked meal and a few hours of feeling human again. Chin stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through disbelief, concern, and something that might have been admiration. "Mr. Morgan, people are already angry at you. This will make it worse. A lot worse." Frank's response was quiet but firm. Then they can be angry at a full table. I'm asking. Permission, not opinion. Chin took the request to Colonel Hastings, who sat behind his desk with the Geneva Conventions open in front of him and his malaria-damaged hand tucked carefully in his pocket. He read Frank's letter 3 times, his eyes scanning for loopholes or problems or reasons to say no. Finally, he signed the approval form with his good hand and stamped it official. Unusual, yes. Unprecedented, certainly, but technically permitted under supervised cultural exchange provisions, and if anyone was watching from Washington or Geneva, this was the kind of thing that made American treatment of prisoners look humane and measured. When Chin gathered the women in the mess hall to deliver the news, chaos erupted. Some were excited, their faces lighting up at the prospect of real food and real hospitality. Some were suspicious, convinced it was a trap or a test or some elaborate cruelty disguised as kindness. Yuki practically bounced on her toes, already imagining what American home cooking might taste like. Maria crossed her arms and said nothing, her face carefully neutral. Others argued in rapid Japanese, voices rising and falling in waves of debate. Keiko stood apart from the discussion, her mind working through calculations of risk and dignity and what acceptance might mean. Her pride said refuse. Her pride said they were Red Cross nurses, protected personnel, and accepting this invitation was accepting their status as prisoners instead of wrongly detained neutrals. But something else in her, something quieter and more honest, wanted to understand these strange Americans who brought ice water and taught them to whistle for dogs and played music that made even enemies want to sing along. She raised her hand for silence. We vote. Those who want to go, raise your hand. 32 hands went up. Keiko looked at each woman's face, reading hope and fear and hunger in equal measure. Then she raised her own hand. 33. More than half. Democracy in captivity. We'll go. But we go with dignity. We accept their hospitality the way nurses accept any kindness, with grace and without forgetting who we are. The women began preparing immediately, washing their least worn clothes, practicing English phrases for thank you, and this is delicious, and what a beautiful home. Yuki taught them an old Japanese folk song about gratitude and homecoming, something they could offer as a gift if the moment felt right. The energy in the barracks shifted, became lighter somehow, as if hope was a physical thing that took up less space than despair. But then the news broke. 2 days before the scheduled dinner, headlines screamed across every newspaper in Texas and beyond. Japanese forces had executed American prisoners in Burma. The photos were grainy but clear enough. Bodies, atrocities, evidence of systematic cruelty that confirmed every terrible thing the propaganda had ever claimed. The images spread like poison through communities already, tense with grief and anger. And suddenly every Japanese person, prisoner or not, became guilty by association. A crowd gathered at the camp gates that evening, maybe 30 people holding signs and shouting threats. The guards formed a line between the fence and the mob, their rifles held ready but not aimed, their faces uncertain. These were local boys, many of them guarding local prisoners, and the line between duty and loyalty to hometown sentiment was growing dangerously thin. Inside the barracks, the women huddled together in silence, listening to the hatred wash over them in waves of sound they didn't need to understand to know they were in danger. Frank's ranch was vandalized that same night. Someone painted slurs across the barn door in dripping red letters. Someone cut his fence lines, letting cattle wander into the neighboring property. His phone rang constantly with threats and curses until he finally unplugged it from the wall and sat in his dark kitchen, staring at his son's photograph and wondering if mercy was supposed to hurt this much. Lieutenant Chin arrived at the women's barracks the next morning, with her face carefully composed and her voice professionally neutral. The dinner is canceled. Colonel's orders. Too dangerous for everyone involved. The women received the news in silence. No one protested. No one argued. They'd learned long ago that hope was a luxury that could be revoked without warning, and the smart thing was to never expect it in the first place. Keiko nodded once and turned away, her hands finding Hiroshi's photo in her pocket, her fingers tracing the worn edges that she knew by heart. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk, watching moonlight paint shadows on the ceiling and thinking about all the small kindnesses that had added up over the past month. The ice water, the rattlesnake warnings, the music and laughter and moments when the war had seemed very far away. She thought about Frank Morgan's face when he'd smiled at their singing, thought about the way he'd fixed their water pump first, thought about a father who'd lost his son and was trying to find some way to make that loss mean something other than just more hate. Through the window, she could see Frank's truck parked beyond the fence in the dusty area where he usually picked them up for work. But it was Saturday night. There was no work tomorrow, no reason for him to be there, yet there he sat, alone in the cab, his silhouette dark against the moonlit prairie. He'd come anyway, came even though the dinner was canceled, even though his barn was vandalized, even though the whole town had turned against him. Came because maybe that's what integrity looked like when everything else was stripped away. Keiko pressed her hand against the cold glass and felt something break inside her. Not hope breaking, not faith crumbling, but the wall she'd built around her heart, the one that said Americans were demons and trust was suicide and survival meant staying hard and closed and safe. That wall cracked just enough to let in a sliver of terrible, dangerous possibility. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, the world had room for more than hate, that maybe courage looked like an empty truck in the darkness, that maybe mercy wasn't weakness but the hardest kind of strength, the kind that cost everything and expected nothing in return. She pulled Hiroshi's photo from her pocket and whispered to it in the darkness. "I wish you could meet him. I think you'd understand what he's trying to do. I think you'd tell me it's okay to believe in something good again." The photo, as always, offered no response. But the moon kept shining and Frank's truck remained in the dust, and somewhere in the space between grief and grace, Keiko felt the first seeds of something new beginning to take root. 3 days passed in silence that felt heavier than words. The women worked the fields with their heads down and their mouths closed, and the cowboys kept their distance like the space between them had turned to broken glass. The bridge that had been building collapsed so completely that Keiko wondered if she'd imagined the whole thing, if the laughter and music and small moments of connection had been nothing more than wishful thinking in a world that didn't have room for wishes. Memorial Day. Sunday arrived with a sunrise that turned the prairie gold and red, colors that reminded Keiko of the rising sun flag and made her chest tight with homesickness so acute it felt like physical pain. She sat on the edge of her bunk and thought about Hiroshi, wondered what he'd looked like in his final moments, whether he'd been afraid or angry or just tired of a war that made no sense to anyone except the men who'd started it. She thought about Frank's son, that boy in the photograph tucked by the fence post, wondered if he'd died quickly or slowly, whether his last thoughts were of home or of the buddies dying beside him. All these mothers and fathers and lovers and friends, scattered across continents, grieving people they'd never met who'd killed people they'd loved. The mathematics of it made Keiko's head hurt. How did you calculate the worth of mercy when the ledgers were written in blood and every side had debts that could never be repaid? Mid-morning, Lieutenant Chen appeared at the barracks door wearing a sundress instead of her uniform. The women stared at her like she'd grown wings. Chen never wore civilian clothes. Chen was Army through and through, regulations and protocol and the careful distance of military bearing. But here she stood in a floral print dress with her hair down, smiling in a way that looked both nervous and determined. "Get ready. We're going to dinner." The silence that followed was so complete that Keiko could hear her own heartbeat. Finally, Maria spoke, her voice careful and confused. "But it was canceled. You told us it was canceled." Chen's smile grew wider. "Frank didn't get the memo." The truck ride to Morgan Ranch felt like moving through a dream. Keiko sat in the back with the other women, their bodies pressed together, nobody speaking because words felt too small for whatever was about to happen. Through the dust and heat shimmer, the ranch emerged like a mirage. But this wasn't the working ranch they knew, the place of vegetable rows and cattle pens and purposeful labor. This was something else entirely. Tables had been arranged in a horseshoe shape across the yard, a dozen mismatched tables covered with tablecloths that ranged from gingham to lace to what looked like old bedsheets pressed into service. Frank stood near the house with Tommy and 3 other ranch hands, just 5 men total. No townspeople, no neighbors, no one else willing to risk reputation or safety for the sake of keeping a promise. Billy Shaw was absent, his loyalty to Frank finally hitting a limit it couldn't cross. But Billy's wife Maggie stood near the porch in her church dress, setting out plates with hands that shook slightly, her presence a quiet rebellion against everything her husband and her community expected. Frank stepped forward as the women climbed down from the truck, his hat in his hands, his voice steady despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. Folks in town couldn't make it. We figured we'd go ahead anyway. On the tables, Keiko saw food that made her throat close with emotion. Fried chicken glistening with grease and care, mashed potatoes whipped smooth and topped with butter, green beans cooked with bacon, biscuits that smelled like her grandmother's kitchen even though her grandmother had never made anything resembling an American biscuit, sweet tea sweating in glass pitchers, and at each place setting, something that made several women gasp out loud. A small Japanese flag, folded carefully from napkins, placed with obvious respect and intention. Maggie Shaw noticed their reaction and spoke through Chen's translation, her words tumbling out fast like she needed to say them before courage failed. Frank said you were nurses. Nurses don't get to choose sides, they just save who's in front of them. That deserves respect. They ate awkwardly at first, the silence broken only by the sound of forks on plates and the occasional murmured thank you. But gradually, as bellies filled and the food worked its ancient magic of transforming strangers into guests, conversation began to flow. Chen translated back and forth, her voice growing more animated as she stopped being a military officer and became simply a bridge between 2 groups of people trying to understand each other across an impossible divide. Halfway through the meal, Frank stood. His movements were deliberate, like a man who'd rehearsed this moment in his head but still wasn't sure he'd get it right. I don't know much about speeches, but my boy would have been 23 today. He believed we were fighting for something better than hate. So, thank you for letting us practice that. Chen translated, and Keiko felt the words hit her like a physical force. Before she could stop herself, before pride or caution or survival instinct could intervene, she was standing too. Her hands shook as she pulled out Hiroshi's photograph, the one she'd kept hidden for so long that the edges were soft as cloth. She held it up so Frank could see, so everyone could see. He was a teacher, drafted against his will, dead at Okinawa fighting a war he never believed in. I think he would have liked your son. I think they would have been friends in a world that made more sense than this one. The silence that followed was sacred. Then Frank nodded once, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears, except Cowboys didn't cry, not in front of people, not even when their hearts were breaking for the millionth time. I think they would have been friends too. I think that's what we're supposed to remember. That before they were soldiers, they were just boys who wanted to live. After the meal, Yuki asked through Chen if she could sing. She stood near the house and let her voice rise into the Texas sky, a Japanese folk song about returning home, about longing and loss and the hope that somewhere beyond the horizon, peace was waiting. Her voice was joined by others, a chorus of women who'd survived Manila and cattle trucks and propaganda and fear, who'd learned that sometimes the only weapon left was beauty. The only resistance was refusing to let war kill every soft thing inside. When the song ended, Tommy picked up his guitar from where it leaned against the porch railing. He played Red River Valley slow and aching, each note hanging in the air like a prayer. The melody was American, but the longing was universal, and Keiko understood for the first time that grief spoke the same language everywhere. That a mother crying in Tokyo sounded exactly like a mother crying in Texas. That love and loss and the desperate hope for something better than this were the things that made people human, not the flags they were born under or the uniforms they were forced to wear. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the whole ranch in amber light, Frank presented each woman with a small burlap bag. Seeds, tomatoes, Beans, squash, practical things that would grow into food and life and continuity. He handed them out one by one, meeting each woman's eyes, acknowledging their humanity in a way that transcended language or politics, or the artificial divisions that made neighbors into enemies. When he reached Keiko, she accepted the bag with both hands, cradling it like it held something more precious than seeds. She met his eyes and spoke in careful English, words she'd been practicing all week for a dinner she thought would never happen. When war ends, if we go home, I will plant these, and I will remember there was mercy in Texas. Frank tipped his hat, the same gesture he'd made that first day, through the fence, but now it carried the weight of everything that had passed between them. All the small kindnesses and quiet rebellions, all the moments when choosing humanity had cost something but had been worth it anyway. As the truck carried them back toward camp, Keiko looked back at the ranch. Frank stood by the fence next to his son's photograph, a solitary figure against the vast Texas landscape. He raised one hand in farewell. She raised hers in return and felt the seeds shift in her pocket, felt the weight of possibility, felt something that might have been hope or might have been faith or might have been the simple recognition that even in the darkest times there were still people who chose light. The war would end eventually. They would go home, or they wouldn't. The future was uncertain and probably hard and likely full of more grief than joy. But tonight Keiko had a full stomach and a pocket full of seeds and the knowledge that somewhere in West Texas, a cowboy had proven that mercy wasn't weakness, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was set a table and invite the enemy to dinner.